Vision podcast by Enolla Consulting.
Rich Miles, welcome. Lovely to meet you. Lovely to meet you in
too.
person. I think the research team was so excited about the conversation they had with me. They're saying, you can't wait till you see Rich. You're going to have an amazing conversation with him. So thank you for joining and welcome to the Human Vision podcast.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. Let's introduce you. So, Rich Miles, you're the CEO and founder, I think, of the Diversity Standards Collective, which is super interesting. I want to talk about that. The Diversity Standards Collective, DSC, is an agency that creates and checks for authenticity in all content that features or targets diverse communities. The DSC strives to help any agency or brand or publisher create work that never offends or misrepresents. Really interesting. Something we all see all too often, I think, in advertising today. So, and Rich, prior to that, you've worked as a creative director, I know.
Yep.
You actually created the first gender pronoun app. That's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's live and it's on App Store. However, it's not widely used yet, but it's a great app. So thank you very much.
Is it for clunky old people like me that kind of go, they there?
It basically was my first dip into like doing anything community centered, and it was like as in like focus for a business perspective. And it's you can put in any form of text, and it will find the pronouns that are in there, and it will replace them with like they, them, or Ziza pronouns. So it just makes it simple for people to amend documents or non-positive topic.
Do you know what? Let me do this back to front because I just want to follow this. I'm going to chase that rabbit for a minute.
Yeah, go on.
Tell me about that. How important do you think that is? Because there'll be a lot of people that now we see email signatures, my pronouns are.
Yep.
And there are a lot of generationally, perhaps, a lot of people find this a little bit tricky. How important do you think getting people's pronouns right is?
I mean, I think it's as important as getting someone's name right. It's kind of how I look at it.
That's a really nice thing. Say more about that if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I mean, it's an easy thing to get someone's name right. It's an easy thing to get someone's pronouns right. It's an easy thing you ask someone's name, you can ask someone their pronouns. And I think it's that simple. Pronouns have been around since 1375. The pronouns they, them were used singularly before the word shit has been created.
Is that true?
It's an interesting fact.
Who knew?
Yeah. So they've been around for years. Chaucer, Shakespeare use they, them pronouns in there. So it's the historical nature of pronouns is really interesting because realistically in the 1900s we stopped using them.
Do you know why?
I don't know the full history in depth, but I think that it would have been around sort of binary focus on.
I was going to say, it just become very binary.
That's exactly that. And obviously the change in the way that we the English language is spoken anyway has had its changes in words move with different times and stuff like that. But realistically, pronouns have been around for hundreds of years, and this is just people reclaiming certain ways. And do you know what? If I left my phone here and you didn't know who I was, you'd say, "Oh, someone's left their phone here." So it's in our language now that we use singular pronouns. So realistically, people just aren't necessarily putting two and two together to say, actually, this is something that we do every day, and I can continue to do it just out of respect for somebody that I like or am working with.
And you know, that's the thing for me, what I like about it, is it's the honouring, isn't it? It's just that honouring. I've been sort of talking with someone who is in a trans situation. And the reference to they and them is so interesting because it's almost like slightly counterintuitive, isn't it? You have to get your brain around, because I think I've been so hardwired in that binary him and her. Yeah. Actually, but then here's what I realise with it. If I actually care about that person, then I'll care enough to use the pronoun correctly, right?
Well, exactly that. And I think, there's always room for human error or forgetfulness, right? Sometimes we all meet each other, we forget people's names, and you'll ask again out of politeness. You're like, "I'm really sorry, but I've forgotten your name," or "I'm really sorry, but I've forgotten your pronouns." Is absolutely kind of fine. I've got a trans cousin, and they've gone through sort of different as they've gone on their gender journey, different pronouns that they use. And realistically, you put the same effort in as you do, as you say, someone's name, or if someone's got maybe a name that you're not used to doing that sort of sound, you will, practice or think, how do I pronounce your name? And pronunciation is important, and you'll correct yourself. So it's just putting the same effort on all forms of addressing people, really. So I don't think it's a wild kind of weird thing to add to what we do. It's just part of someone's identity and how we address them. And realistically, when we're in front of somebody, we don't use third pronouns.
No, we don't.
You'd use your name anyway. So It's only when you're kind of not with one or someone or addressing them through email or outside that you would maybe use those pronouns. So it's just about.
I love it. No, I absolutely love it. So forgive me, I kind of jumped ahead of myself because let's take you back. When we're fortunate enough to have guests like yourself, we like to start our conversations by talking about your own inclusion story.
Yep.
And we're always interested in kind of your journey to here. Every time I talk to somebody, I'm always fascinated because there's always a kind of rich story that ties them to this inclusion conversation. So without putting you under, raising the bar for you, how do you feel about that? Tell me about your story. What brings you, what's your inclusion story?
I think it's a combination of two paths. It's a combination of my career, my kind of career objectives, and then in combination with my kind of journey with my own identity and my queerness. And I think when I started out my career, I was very focused. I was a young art director, young creative, and I was focused on that. And I was in an agency actually where I was, it was a small advertising agency of about 50 people. I was the only queer person, the only gay kind of person in there for a number of years. And I was really supported and felt really kind of included, shall I say, within that company. So I was in a very safe space. And then 3 years later, or 3 or 4 years later, when I was working on a campaign, we were producing a social media campaign about Win a Wedding. It was super simple. It was on Facebook back in the day when that was the kind of main social media focus. And our objective was to put up like 5 or 6 couples onto the platform, so the next day the followers could start voting for their favourite to win a wedding, essentially, for this brand. The client went home. We had an event that evening where we were interviewing all of the couples, and they had said to us, look, just put them all up tonight. We haven't got much time. Put them all up, and then we'll come in tomorrow morning. We'll start creating the content. One of those couples that night we'd interviewed was an LGBT couple. They were 2 lesbian women, and they were brilliant. They were exciting. They were energizing. They were really something that we saw as sort of agency would ignite and make our followers want to follow their sort of story and their love story. However, the next morning we came in, and the atmosphere was completely different to the energy that had been the night before.
Wow.
And our CEO and MD took us into a room and said, we've had a call from the marketing director of this brand. They're really disgusted in what we've done. The fact that we've posted a LGBT couple online without asking them, without checking. Their followers aren't ready. Their brand isn't ready. That's not the brand that they're trying to put forward. And kind of went through all these, repeating what the brand manager said. So at that time they had said, we're not sure what happens next, but we just needed to let you know that we can't go on with anything else yet until we've resolved this. And I was shocked. I walked downstairs, and I remember just leaving the office and crying. I went to a pub nearby, I think, and my copywriter came with me, and within 5 minutes my MD and my CEO were there. Obviously had honed in on that, that would be my maybe reaction, and they were just obviously super supportive. We're not going to do anything they've said. Seeing my reaction and their support for me was enough that they just turned back to the brand and said no. But it was the first time for me I had sort of not felt like I had been included in that world, and the fact that it was a part of your identity that you couldn't change, or that I couldn't change, and I was very proud of, was much more hurtful. And I've been very privileged up till then to not experience that, and I know a number of people will experience that, a number of things in different times of their life. But yeah, it was quite shocking at the time, and led me to my gay job and my day job, they call it, to start looking.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, led me to start basically finding more of my people, more LGBT people in the industry, which is where I came across Advertising, who were Pride AM at the time, a volunteer group, and I started doing creative reviews for them, basically looking at ads and looking at the inclusion representation of them for the community. And that's sort of, those two journeys led me to creating the Diversity Standards Collective, which kind of combines them both.
Well, I'll talk to you about that in a minute, but I want to go back to a couple of things you just told us in the story, because that inclusion story is very powerful, and it feels like it's one of those stories that has become the kind of catalyst to make you a bit of an activist around this as well, which is super interesting. But 2 points you made in it that I'm intrigued about. One is that it was the first time you experienced what we would call being other.
Yeah.
And that's actually a very interesting thing, isn't it? Because often we talk about the idea of diversity and inclusion, and we say diversity is not inclusion. And people say, what do you mean? We said, well, diversity is a fact.
Yeah.
Right? This is my social identity. I'm made up of whatever the characteristics might be. But inclusion and its opposite, exclusion, are feelings, and how I'm made to feel about my facts.
Yeah.
So in that moment, how were you made to feel about your facts?
I was made to feel that I wasn't included. I think what's interesting about being being a white gay male is that in a lot of spaces or new spaces I walk into, people don't know unless I'm wearing a flowery shirt, which
is fabulous, by the
which
way.
is fabulous,
Just
and not a
saying.
gay thing either.
Just saying.
Available for everyone. But the privilege that I hold there is that I can either come out or not come out, and so I go into a space, and if they don't know I'm LGBT, then
really important.
the feeling is included. And I think what I learned from my identity is as soon as I'm an over-talker and oversharer. As soon as people start talking to me and find out I married or I adopted a daughter and things like that, that you can see, or when they find out that I'm queer, the feeling changes, the mood slightly changes, whether it's a slight look or a slight change in body position or something. You can feel it, and I think most LGBT people will say that they have to come out at most occasions that they step into. Other identities don't have that privilege. You walk into a room and they know who you are, and you maybe have that straight off the bat. But I think what was interesting in that experience was that in the surroundings of a client I'd worked with for a long, long time, I'd made ads from, and I would have discussed as friends. We'd had wine together. We'd, had that relationship with them.
Yeah.
So for them to turn around with them, I was like, I completely have no respect for you anymore. And it created a fire in my belly. It created a fire in my belly also because I had the support around me from my team, and that I was able to do it in that way. I know a number of this happens all the time, and people don't have that support, and it's swept under the rug. Or sure, we just won't mention it. That's our big client. Okay, we just have to do this at this thing, and there's a number of those sort of conversations which we're trying to make sure don't happen anymore.
That was kind of my second point, because my second point was you said obviously, and I was like, well, hold on a minute. What do you mean obviously? So I think that is a really good part of the story, to see your chief executive and your MD were in the pub with you 5 minutes later, and they were saying we're not doing this because I have to tell you, that's an exceptional allyship story. It shouldn't be, but there are an awful lot of organisations that would say, "Oh, Rich, don't worry, we've got other accounts we can work on." And being candid with you, I've seen that process go through. I have I'm sometimes described as white presenting, right? Well, I'm not white presenting. I'm mixed race, right? So often I sometimes get caught in those interesting conversations, and I've heard conversations about, we don't want to send this particular person who presents this way to see this client. And you go, but why would you have that person as a client if you couldn't send your people to see them because they're black or they're whatever? I mean, what is that?
Yeah. And
what is that?
It's bias coming out,
there you
and
go.
people want their money over anything else. And I think
money over morals. Right?
Exactly. And I think I worked at a small agency who they made their decisions. They had no one else to answer to other than themselves. So they were able to put full support because that's who they were. They are good, as you say, good people, good allies, and
with values.
With
right?
values, exactly. And I try and I was, as you say, I feel quite lucky and privileged that I had that support network, which is why I set up the DSC, because I want to use that privilege to make sure that other people have that support and privilege and feel included from the number of things that we do, but also be the bridge to make sure that I am safeguarding those people that we're speaking to with the brand so that they don't experience that, but also to kind of make sure that everyone's included along the way. But
completely,
and
I'd be interested to understand what do you say to queer people or your community, your tribe, as you say. Oh, by the way, just before I say that, I think that story's got a great and happily ever after point, because didn't the managing director become your business partner?
So the CEO of the company,
the CEO was it?
He Neil, he's a great friend.
That's amazing.
And my business partner, a straight guy from Birmingham, came from a kind of working class background, came into advertising, had to change himself as well, his accent, in order to fit in.
There you go.
And years later, we had this bond. We both had that sort of similar connection. And we were like, we can do something. We can make some change. So we set up together.
It's incredible.
And
Gosh, so many nerves you're touching with me about the accent reduction thing. But what I was going to ask you was, what advice would you give to queer people or people who are perceived as other? Because it's a nice point you made that you don't necessarily present it that way. So the stigma doesn't necessarily follow you. But what's your counsel to people that are queer within a straight environment about that? What do you say about that?
it's very difficult because obviously every situation is very, very, very different, and it's
Yeah.
whether or not you can find. You need to find your allies or your people. I
That's
think
good,
is the
yeah.
that's the first thing I did, and I had a very supportive network, but because none of them were LGBT, they didn't have the experience I had. So I really wanted to find people who had that experience. This is where I found
Yeah.
sort of advertising at the very early on, where people could relate to those two forms of being in this industry, and I think
So interesting.
whatever community you're in, including queer community in advertising, reach out, find other
Find your people.
There's really good, there's advertising, there's networks in different agencies now, there's queer adfolk, there's lots of like different things in advertising where you can find people. Just don't be afraid to reach out, I would say, is the big point, because you
That's
can
really
be
nice.
afraid to be like,
Yeah.
maybe I shouldn't, or I don't know them, or there's a perception online that people are, I don't know, sort of maybe harder to reach out to. But I think that that's my advice to anyone, is to find your network, even if it's a small group or one other person, it can really change the direction of where you're going. And if you are in a space that's not safe, find people that can help you or guide you to be in the space that you are.
Really good counsel. Thank you for that. Let's talk about DSC. I kind of got a sense about why it started, but tell me how it started. Tell me about what you do. Just give us a flavour of what you're up to, because it sounds like a fascinating bit of work that you do. And I'm particularly interested because you're talking about advertising agencies and brands and so on. I'm kind of going to chase you around a bit on the idea of we've seen a lot of stuff in the past, particularly after the murder of George Floyd, of a lot of virtue signalling and sort of just making sure you've got the right looking people standing in the advert. Oh, have you got a black person there? Oh, hang on. How do you deal with all that, and what do you do? Just tell us a bit more about the DSC story.
So the DSC itself, like the point I got to in the beginning was that the DSC was sort of born out of my want for a community and the advertising kind of industry. And actually, the DSC itself was actually a side project to the agency I had set up, which was an LGBT creative agency. It was called What's Normal. So I'd wanted to do an LGBT creative agency, but
so that was the hustle to start.
That was a hustle to start with. I wanted to be a creative, and I wanted to go into that. And when I went into it, my business partner, my boss at the time, was like, but the biggest barrier you're going to have is, how are you, small agency, going to go against the big ones who have got queer people in there? How are you going to show difference? And we'd had an ad that had been banned by the ASA a few years before. And it was created by 95% females, and then there was me. And I think it was like 9 men at the ASA had banned it. And there was a really interesting conversation online about why it had been banned, who it had been banned by. And that started the thought in our heads about what was if we created a research part of this company that could check any content or creative from those very communities, because there's actually a lot of white gay men, there's a lot of other people in D&I roles who have to answer for lots of other communities they're not part of. And I think that can be really, really tough, because the only people who can really tell you their experience is the people who've experienced it.
Of course.
So the DSC, the Diversity Standards Collective, was born as a sort of advertising standards authority, diversity standards collective,
really
as like
smart.
a community focused way of doing the same thing. But within a month of setting up both companies, no work came through the creative agency, and a lot of interest peaked around, we'd like to check our work, or can you connect us to these people?
Really?
So we pivoted and shut down the creative agency. And
You closed it down?
Closed it down. We found ourselves two ad guys running a research company, and brilliant. And I think what was interesting is that it built so naturally, because over the years of me finding my people, shall we say, I'd built a really strong network of LGBT people, of people from lots of different communities, because there were kind of all the people who had similar experiences to me. So the DSC actually started with our first job was with Coca-Cola, which was really amazing, and another company. And, I don't know if they know this now, but some of those people on that panel were from my family and friends, because that's who I knew. And, the industry was at a sticking point at that point. It was like, where do we find these people? Where do you find them?
They pay the invoice now, don't they?
Yeah, exactly that. It was just, the actual art of it all was just, we run a research company, we're not researchers, but we know communities and we know how to trustingly speak to people, and we enjoy it. So that's kind of where the DSC sort of started flourishing in its inclusion, is we know how to include because we are them. if that makes sense.
So I love that. I love that notion of the lived experience, right? Because I think sometimes we see this in kind of our leadership work. What you find that the people making the decisions are the furthest away from the customer. Right? You go, don't you need to make the people that are closest to the customer make the decision? Wouldn't that be a better idea?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you talked about finding your people. Something we talked about off air was also another part of your tribe is you come from a neurodiverse position as well, right?
Yeah.
So I'm super, super interested in how you do research with your neurospiciness that you bring to that. How does that all work out for you?
It's a strength and it's a weakness,
Yeah,
and it molds in the middle as well. I think I didn't have any idea that I had ADHD quite so badly, or ADHD at all, until about 2 years ago. Being a creative, thinking of 100 ideas at once in the most ludicrous of situations was part and parcel of the job, and I loved it. It lent into everything that I kind of enjoyed and how my brain worked. Finding myself then running a company when everything was kind of about logic, about proposals, about Excel spreadsheets, I just started tripping up a lot.
Yeah,
Started forgetting a lot. My brain couldn't work. I find it very difficult to kind of find memories or thoughts or things like that when it's kind of all going on at once. So it was actually the team who were like, "I think you need to get tested for ADHD," and I just thought I was a bit crap. And I I got into a bit of a low point because I was like, I'm not achieving. I'm not doing very well. You know, being a founder of a company that you've sort of set up is difficult in its most instances.
It's complicated. Yeah.
So I went and got tested, and I got kind of full marks in every different sector of ADHD that you could have, which just made sense to me. And so what it led to is me more understanding where my strengths lie. So meeting people, networking, I love that. That feeds into my ADHD because I can flit around, talk to people, have different conversations. I never struggle for words or anything like that. So that's really brilliant. Where it becomes hard is when I really have to focus, or I have to remember 19 things at once, like different people's names or I've walked into client situations where I forgot whole projects or whole moments that have just happened, and I haven't forgot them. I was talking to you outside the agreement. Mine's like a ball pit, whereas I have to dig into this ball pit to find the balls, but I need. Now I know I have ADHD, and I kind of I put on my email signature and I say it affects my memory with a link to how it affects my memory.
Oh, really?
And I talk to my team, just to know that my cognition may just take a little bit of time to get to, and it's normally I just need a prompt or a reminder or something to find what the conversation was, and then it all comes flooding back. But obviously in instances when you don't have that, or you're not surrounded with it, it could be difficult because people think you're either disinterested or you can't remember or you're not bothered. So it can be hard in those instances, but brilliant. I think as a founder, a lot of founders we were talking about before, like Stephen Bartlett, Richard Branson, all have. And actually, speaking to Ali Owen from the Brixton Finishing School and the other day, who also has ADHD and stuff like that. It's very much a founder's thing because you have the energy and strength to be like, oh, we can do that, or we can go here, and you've got no real barriers to go and speak to people or do stuff. So it's a brilliant founder's, I think, personality trait when you lean into it. But it can cause a bit of trouble when you're always a bit chaotic.
It's really funny. We talk in our business about the butterfly and the bees, right? And I have a butterfly's brain, right? So I can stay with you in the conversation unless I see something else.
Yeah.
And then I've gone. I might still be sitting here with you, but my mind's already thinking about the next thing, or you might have said something that would triggered something in my mind.
Exactly that, yeah.
And this is, I kind of have this explosion in my brain about all these things that just blow up in my head. But actually, that's good from a creative point of view, as you say. But then you have the bees that can just build the hive and make it work and all the rest of it. And I think that the thing that I learned, I'm not diagnosed, but the thing I learned is that the worst thing I can do as a butterfly is try and be a bee, right? Because it's just not a good idea.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it, actually.
It doesn't work. It's and I suspect probably if you talk to the bees, they would say, probably best thing we can do is be bees and not try and be butterflies. But that's in some respects part of the whole diversity conversation, isn't it? That can I be me, and can I let you be you?
Yeah.
And then what happens then? Because I think we see in our world, we talk a lot about the difference between fitting in and fitting together. And the idea of saying, if I'm fitting in, I'm probably going to have to do some editing, some social editing.
Yeah.
And maybe show up in a very inauthentic way. But if I'm fitting together, then you just bring all who you are, and I'll bring all I am. And I bet you what we create, it might be a bit messy and a bit sort of hard to kind of codify, but I bet it'd be glorious.
Yeah. I mean, jumping on your metaphor, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at the industry. If you think the industry's always been one type of person, it's like a garden full of ants. Isn't it? And actually, what you want is some butterflies, some bees, a squirrel or two,
right?
a barking dog. You want all of that to
Yeah.
set the scene of a
So nice.
beautiful garden with loads of stuff going on, with kids playing with like all those different animals. And I think there's a good point to talk about inclusion and belonging, because to make that garden or to make that world the most exciting place it can be, you need all the different types. You don't want to mold everyone into those ants, because 1,000 ants in your garden's annoying, but 20 ants and 4 butterflies and that, you know, it's a better place.
But I think I love that. And again, this might not be helpful, because I think the two of us are going to have this sparking each other's ideas.
We're gardens.
So we're going to go gardens. But do you know what I like? Because I think the thing for us is that we talk about the idea of what we think about inclusion from the perspective of social ecology. And actually, the thing about ecology is that, take your garden analogy, everything in the garden is there for a purpose.
Yeah.
And everything in the garden makes a valuable contribution, without which the garden wouldn't be the garden, right?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is something we've missed, and I think the problem is that perhaps in the diversity space, we tend to, and I'm going to bring this back to your work in a minute, we tend to think that it's about treating everybody the same. We're actually, in the inclusion space, it's not about treating everybody the same, it's about treating everybody equally well.
Yes. It's a good way of putting it.
And butterflies and bees like different stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah, different plants eat different foods.
That's exactly it.
We could go on forever.
We could. But tell me about DSC. Let me just go back to that for a second. What do you think people miss when they're creating content?
Yeah.
So when they're thinking about content, and I like your point about it's about being authentic for you.
Yeah.
So what do you think they miss when they're branding, their marketing, when it comes to this whole conversation? Talk to me about that.
I think it is the whole ecosystem. So we focus on
nice.
as I say, like there's TV ads or print ads, and we want to focus on everything that's in that you can see or hear or feel. I think that what's missed is there's a focus on casting, or there's a focus on people, or there's a focus on something in there, but they've missed everything else. And I think the industry is getting a lot better at more diverse casting, but casting without culture, in a lot of the times is tokenism. And culture without casting is appropriation in a lot of ways. You've just got the culture, I haven't got the people. You need a combination of them both. And in order to understand really what culture and that person is, you have to think about the location that they're in. You have to think about the action, the words that they're saying, how they're saying it, why they're saying it. You have to think about what they're wearing. And we were talking outside as the other people in that scenario also feed into how that person's represented or why they're represented in that way. So what we look at when we look at comms and campaigns for people is, yes, we're looking at how a cast member can be fitting in, but we're looking at what everything means to make that person belong in that scenario. I think what's been wrong with advertising is that you see an ad, maybe it's an LGBT person, maybe it's a person from the black community, and you're like, that's not like my grandma's house. That's like a white woman's house. Or what food are they eating on the table? That's not what I would eat.
Point.
There's a really nice, when we first started, there was we were checking an ad for a home kind of estate agent company, and I remember we had this final edit of an ad, and it was this there was a black family enjoying a barbecue outside, and we brought our consultants in, so our sort of professional consultants are people who are professional within the ad industry, so creatives, directors, filmmakers, actors, and they also are from the community, so they can sort of dual their lived experience and their professional experience on that guidance. And they all came in and they laughed. And as a white guy, I wasn't necessarily sure what they were laughing at, and I just kind of pressed and said, what do you find interesting, or what do you find kind of funny about the ad? And they said, that's not someone from Caribbean or African communities barbecue. There is a burger, everyone's got one burger and an orange juice on the table, and they were like, if their experience, it was lots of abundance of food, lots of flavors, herbs, meat. And, from my experience in my family, that's what happens in ours as well. And from like a Gambian or Indian or Caribbean perspective, there's always this part in there. And it's really interesting to think, do you know what, that brand has spent so long thinking about the cast, thinking about what they're saying, where they are, but they hadn't thought about what food was on the table. And that's the small nuance that made that whole community switch off and think, we don't belong in that scenario. So they needed to think, and I think from then on we always talk about this. It's like, okay, we need to look at everything, because even the wrong hairbrush on a table can make you think that that's not right.
Point.
So we look at it in that sense. We're safeguarding brands to make sure that when they include people, they're trying to make sure they're telling a story about a community, that community resonates with it and it feels like their experience, or they can be like, oh, that was like mine, or look at those pictures on the wall, or look at those things, that reminds me of my grandma's house or my mum's house or my boyfriend's house.
But that's your authenticity point, right?
Yeah.
So this is perhaps a slightly unfair question, so feel free to ignore it. But how do you sort the inauthentic from the authentic? How do you sort the people that are going, I want to sell this product to all these black people, and so can you make it look like I kind of really know what I'm talking about with the lived experience? Yeah. How do you? Is there a way to kind of get to that?
It's an interesting point because the company that we are only in the area of marketing and comms, which is normally where people are putting out stuff that that I think gets called out for maybe being inauthentic if their company's not. Now we haven't got facilities at the moment or to kind of focus on those areas, and people are doing it brilliantly. Like we work and we a lot of the time put them in touch with companies who do that. What we look at and in those groups is we just make sure that our consultants are able to say whatever they like, however they like, and call out what they need to call out.
Really nice.
So there is a lot of occasions when we be working with big brands and they're like, well, what are you doing about this? Why are you doing this at this point? Why is this brand doing this? We've refused work from certain brands because when we've reached out to our collective, and before we've even reached out to them, we're like, this isn't good enough. Like, why are they doing that from certain brands to this community? It feels problematic. So we've refused work before simply because we know that they are doing it out of what's the word that you used? They're doing it inauthentic about it, or they haven't.
Virtue signaling.
Exactly that. There's also this other part of what we do, right? Whereas that we talk about quite a lot at the DSC, which is a lot of the brands are going to be making this marketing, and our job is to protect and work with the consumers who are viewing this. Now, if people put representation out wrong and they showcase, it can be really damaging across that community and outside because people get the wrong idea. This is what the problem we've had for years is stereotypes, wrong depictions of people can really affect how they're viewed. So that's where we're focused on, that we want to look at. So we really make sure we go into companies, we help them work out. And do you know what? Sometimes we've had also people from different communities say, our community shouldn't be in this ad to take us out. And that happens, and that's the feedback that we give to them and say we can't be in this because of these reasons outside of it. So we're just basically having conversations and working with all the communities to be like, what do you think? Is this okay? Would you do this? And going with their points of view and experience. The DSC don't necessarily give our opinion unless we feel like it's, they're doing so badly that we can't even put it in front of them.
So I like that, because what that's kind of reminded me of and lodged back in my mind is your idea about being the diversity standards agency. So that's really interesting, because if you go back to the advertising standards agency, it's a safeguarding piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, that is such a wonderfully powerful thing to do, to think that you are protecting the authenticity of my identity. And I think that's the side of that conversation that I could get my brain to. Mm-hmm. So to one extent, whether or not the client is virtue signaling is a slightly different point. The real issue is when I look at myself represented on screen or in print or whatever else it might be, I can go, yes, not black people don't do that.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of issues with different companies coming from like their recruitment, their staffing, their approach as a brand, their brands are supporting or not supporting, or there's loads of actually points that a lot of companies are coming in to help those particular areas, like recruitment areas for recruitment companies for diverse communities, etc., etc. So just like they focus on recruitment, we focus on the marketing output.
That's brilliant.
So we don't sometimes have a look into when those companies and what they're doing in those instances, but what we focus on therefore is we know we can make positive change in the authenticity of the representation of the people who are in there, and that's our focus. And as I say, like, it's not the DSC's team's duty to tell those brands what the community think. We bring the community in to either tell them in their hundreds or in their professional experience, like how well and what they're doing. So it's really just making sure that opinion is put across, and that our job is to make sure that that brand or that company understand the feedback and haven't missed something that is actually really integral to what the feedback from that community is.
And my guess is if an organisation typically is coming to you, it's because they want integrity in their presentation.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, we have a vary, right? You can imagine, right? We have people who come to us who are really on board with wanting to make sure representation is there. We have some companies who come and they are like, this is a bit of a tick box for us. And they're the ones that we really hone in on to be like, this can't be a tick box. This has to be something that you're representing well. You have to be listening to the community. And so it varies, but I think what it always does is making companies, marketing directors, brand managers sit and listen to a group of people from a particular community talk about how they feel always leaves an impact. It never doesn't. So whatever their intentions coming in, I think they definitely change when they're coming out because they realise there's nothing you can beat than human interaction. So making a judgment on someone before you met them is, nobody likes a judgment on them before they've met. And then when you meet someone, you're like, they're actually really lovely, or they actually meant this. And I think that's the importance of qualitative research, or the stuff we do, is putting those people in front of those the brands to really realise that this is an important part of their marketing consumer.
Absolutely. I can see a massive, massive future for you, and that is brilliant.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. One last question for you. Over the recent months, this sort of diversity, inclusion, equity, inclusion space has kind of come in for a bit of heat.
Yeah.
What do you think we should be doing to make a compelling case for diversity, equity, and inclusion within the workplace?
Well, do you know what? It's a really, really interesting question, because I think diversity, equity, and inclusion now comes quite loaded. It comes with a lot of heat.
Very much so.
I speak to a lot of other companies who work in the same space, and we're all like, this is a very difficult time right now for especially converting other clients to look into this and to invest in this. What we try to do at the DSC is kind of reframe what we're doing. So rather than call it diversity and inclusion, we're talking about consumers and audiences, because realistically, DE and I, your consumers are all there. They're all part of those communities. Your communities, it's, if a brand thinks that their consumers aren't diverse, they're kidding themselves. Because whether they fall into disability, religion, gender, sexual orientation, all those things, they 100% will fall into one, or their immediate network, their wives, their husbands, their kids, their friends will fall into those. And people want to look out for their friends and their immediate network. So it's important to everyone. So I think our look at kind of sidestepping that is just making people normalise that conversation and not make it feel like othered or different, and say, actually, this isn't about D, E and I. This is about people. This is about human interactions, being respectful to everybody. And that inherently means that they're from these different communities. It inherently means that you need to include, kind of going back to what we were talking earlier, different plants for different foods. You need to make sure you're looking at it in that way. And I think if people stop, if people think that DE and I isn't important, they're kidding themselves, as say, because they'll just start, as you say, treating everybody in the same way and trying to seek the same things, and they'll lose massive kind of parts of their audiences. Really, really good.
Really, so good. And I think that ecology point is right, isn't it? That ultimately, and I guess this is why I think we feel great warmth towards you, is that it's about creating an environment of authentic belonging, right? It's a place where, is this somewhere I can belong? I always remember that TV show Cheers that was on the TV many years ago, that lovely signature tune, wouldn't you like to go to a place where everybody knows your name and they're glad you came? I feel like, in a way, it's not really much more complicated than that, is it?
Do you know what would be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if everybody went somewhere where they wanted to know everyone's name, or they wanted to speak to everyone, and they just put everybody on the same, like, I'm actually interested in you. Like, sometimes when we do talks to different brands about inclusion or what we do, we'll start it off by being like, who watches Netflix? Who's watching Married at First Sight? Who's seen Titanic? And everyone puts a hand up, and you're like, great, you've all got things in common that we can talk about, before we go into being like, let's think about the differences, because people hone in on, you're this, you're that, you're LGBT, you're that. That's what the focus is, and that needs to come off, and people need to start finding their connections that are meaningful and making it fun. I think D and I can be quite loaded and quite heavy sometimes for the right reasons, right? Yeah. But how can we add some humour? How can we add some realism? And how can we make everyone sit around, a table like this and have a little laugh, relate to each other, talk about their experiences, how they're kind of similar or different, and come out relating and enjoying their time together. And
there's so much more that unites us, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. Rich, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're kidding. We're going to put your details of it for people, because everybody's got to get the gender pronouns out. That's like no.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to double check that it's still up, because it's been around for 5 years now. But yeah.
But they must just work with you as well. I think it'd be fantastic. So thank you so much for taking time to come in and be with us. It's been an absolute honour. Thank you very, very much.
No worries. Really
I hope
enjoyed it.
Good. I'm glad you did. I hope we get to chat some more.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.